first-class ticket, a woman with a modest appearance and a moment that seemed insignificant shook the entire luxurious cabin. They didn't know the one they were belittling was the wife of the airline's owner. And then the door opened. Who walked in and turned everything upside down. The first-class cabin of Stellar Airways flight that day shimmered with light streaming through wide glass windows, the rows of premium leather seats exuding a faint fragrance of high-end perfume, mingling with the delicate scent of champagne. Elwyn Hartwell stepped in, graceful yet confident, wearing a simple but elegant dress, her wrist adorned with an exquisite watch, a gift from her billionaire husband, Cassian Hartwell, a reminder of the day they first met on this very flight. Suddenly, a cold voice cut through Elwyn's thoughts from the front of the cabin. "My apologies, madam, there must be a mistake. This area is exclusively for first-class passengers." The speaker was the chief flight attendant, Marigold Sinclair, tall and striking, her haughty face framed by neatly pinned blonde hair and a flawless navy blue uniform. Marigold's sharp eyes scanned Elwyn's modest attire, her lips curling with subtle skepticism. Elwyn, momentarily taken aback, quickly regained her composure and handed her ticket to Marigold with polite firmness. "I have a first-class ticket. Please check again." Marigold took the ticket, raising an eyebrow, her skepticism intensifying as she deliberately turned the ticket over in her hands, as if searching for an error. Other passengers in the cabin, particularly Ophelia Fairchild, an elegant woman dripping with oversized diamonds, and the striking couple, Octavia and Lucien Kingsley, began glancing at Elwyn, their curiosity tinged with discreet mockery. "Perhaps there's an issue with the booking system," Marigold said slowly, her tone laced with feigned sympathy. "You might be more comfortable in the rear cabin." Marigold's pointed words caused a faint flush to rise on Elwyn's cheeks. She took a deep breath, calmly reiterating, "My husband booked this ticket specifically for me. There can't be any mistake." A few passengers let out soft, mocking chuckles at her words. Elwyn's gaze fell on her watch, the keepsake that steeled her resolve to stand her ground. At that moment, Marigold signaled to the cabin manager, Thaddeus Hale, who approached with a stern expression, his cold eyes fixed on Elwyn as he spoke quietly but firmly. "Madam, please disembark while we verify your ticket information." His voice was as final as a verdict. Elwyn stood motionless, her eyes unwavering with determination. She had no desire to leverage her husband's status, but neither would she allow her dignity to be trampled by prejudice. The atmosphere was taut, like a tightly strung wire, when the aircraft door suddenly swung open. A tall, commanding figure strode into the cabin, drawing every eye. It was Cassian Hartwell himself, the true owner of Stellar Airways, his piercing gaze instantly grasping the situation. In that moment, Elwyn knew this flight would mark a turning point in her life. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew increasingly charged as the gazes of the elite passengers fixed on Elwyn Hartwell. A subtle wave of curiosity, laced with veiled contempt, spread like an invisible yet potent poison. Marigold Sinclair stood there, holding Elwyn's ticket with slender fingers, her grip careless, as if the paper might sully her pristine hands at any moment. Not far away, a middle-aged woman, Ophelia Fairchild, resplendent with a glittering diamond necklace, flashed a pitying smile. Her voice rang out clearly, just loud enough for all to hear. "Oh, how unfortunate. Everyone thinks they can waltz into first class with a few sweet words." A ripple of butterfly-like laughter echoed through the cabin, intensifying the heat rising to Elwyn's face. She stood her ground, struggling to maintain her composure, though waves of emotion surged fiercely within her. Her eyes briefly met those of a stylish young couple, Octavia and Lucien Kingsley, dressed in designer attire, whispering to each other, their glances darting toward her before they stifled giggles behind their hands. Meanwhile, a powerful businessman, Alaric Pembroke, who had just looked up from his financial newspaper, made no effort to hide his impatience. He spoke loudly, deliberately. "How much longer are we going?" "To wait? I have an important meeting to get to." Marigold Sinclair turned to him with a saccharine smile, her voice soft but dripping with sarcasm. "Please bear with us, sir. We'll resolve this matter quickly. Perhaps Mrs. Hartwell would feel more comfortable in economy class. It's more suitable." The phrase "more suitable" landed with unmistakable mockery, causing Elwyn's shoulders to tense. She remained silent, refusing to leverage her husband's name to escape the situation, yet equally unwilling to back down. Her fingers brushed the watch on her wrist, a reminder of the pride she felt as a top-flight attendant before meeting Cassian Hartwell. A soft chuckle came from Ophelia Fairchild's seat, this time laced with sharper malice. "Her husband? Don't tell me she's about to claim he's the CEO of this airline." Another round of light laughter erupted, rubbing salt into Elwyn's silent wounds. She pressed her lips together, steadying her breathing, reminding herself to stay resilient. True dignity didn't lie in clothing or appearances. At that moment, the aircraft door swung open with resolute force. Every eye turned toward it, the mocking laughter dying instantly as the tall, commanding figure of Cassian Hartwell emerged into the light. Silence enveloped the cabin, and everyone suddenly realized that the story unfolding on this flight was about to take a turn they could never have anticipated. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze as the door swung open, revealing the commanding and authoritative figure of Cassian Hartwell. Every eye turned toward the man, the true owner of Stellar Airways, as he stepped forward slowly, each stride radiating absolute confidence and quiet power. The silence was so profound that the sound of his footsteps echoed like a warning bell. Instantly, the haughty expression on Marigold Sinclair's face vanished, replaced by a look of stunned panic. Beside her, cabin manager Thaddeus Hale couldn't conceal his unease. They exchanged a fleeting, anxious glance, fully aware they had just made a grave mistake. Cassian's voice cut through the tension, calm but laced with undeniable authority. "Is there a problem with my wife's seat?" The words "my wife" seemed to thicken the atmosphere, rendering the cabin almost suffocating. The passengers who had previously cast mocking glances at Elwyn Hartwell now sat in stunned silence. Some, like Ophelia Fairchild and the couple Octavia and Lucian Kingsley, averted their gazes, their embarrassment unmistakable. Thaddeus Hale spoke up quickly, attempting to regain control, though his voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, we were just verifying some details about the ticket," Cassian interrupted with a subtle but commanding raise of his brow. "Verifying based on what? Her appearance?" His question sliced through the heart of their prejudice like a razor, leaving Marigold and Thaddeus visibly flustered, with nowhere to hide. Elwyn stood beside her husband, feeling the reassuring warmth of his hand gently resting on her lower back, a simple gesture that conveyed both protection and encouragement. She took a deep breath, suppressing the complex emotions swirling within her. Cassian continued, his voice soft but unyielding, commanding the room's attention. "I would think a company like Stellar Airways would uphold a standard of service rooted in respect and dignity, not in judging passengers by their clothing or appearance." Marigold was so flustered she could barely speak, her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms, her eyes dodging Cassian's piercing gaze. Thaddeus quickly bowed his head, his deference unmistakable. "We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell." Cassian didn't respond, merely glancing at Elwyn with a look filled with reassurance. In that moment, Elwyn understood that Cassian had intervened decisively not just to defend her, but to uproot the condescending attitudes of those before them. This flight, it seemed, had just taken an entirely new course. The moment the aircraft door swung open, every gaze converged on the tall, commanding figure standing at the entrance. It was none other than Cassian Hartwell, the billionaire owner of Stellar Airways. He appeared as if the entire space belonged to him, his natural composure and impeccably tailored navy suit amplifying his commanding presence. The hushed whispers of gossip died instantly, replaced by a taut, absolute silence so profound that the ticking of a watch could have been heard. "Elwyn, Hartwell stood quietly, feeling an invisible shield of protection as Cassian's resolute gaze locked onto her. His steps were deliberate and assured, each one asserting his dominance in the confined space. Passengers like Ophelia Fairchild and the wealthy couple Octavia and Lucian Kingsley, who had earlier dripped with mockery and skepticism, now averted their eyes, their unease unmistakable. Cassian paused beside Elwyn, gently placing a hand on her lower back. The simple yet powerful gesture, both protective and possessive, made those who had judged her moments before squirm with embarrassment. No one dared speak, except for cabin manager Thaddeus Hale, who stammered an explanation. "Mr. Hartwell, it's merely a minor misunderstanding regarding Mrs. Hartwell's seat." Cassian didn't respond immediately, his cold yet composed gaze shifting to Marigold Sinclair, the chief flight attendant who had lost every trace of her earlier arrogance. The color drained from Marigold's face, her hands trembling slightly, fingers clutching the ticket in a desperate grip. Cassian spoke softly, his tone courteous but weighted with authority. "How curious. I've never known such a mix-up to occur on our flights before." Each word he uttered was measured yet piercing, dismantling the last remnants of Marigold's haughty facade. "Are we now assigning seats based on passengers' clothing and appearance, Ms. Sinclair?" The pointed question hung in the air, forcing Marigold to bow her head in abject shame. The atmosphere grew thick with tension. The other passengers, including the impatient businessman Alaric Pembroke and the stern socialite Zephyrine Bellamy, now watched in silence, their eyes betraying subtle hints of regret. Cassian gave Elwyn's hand a gentle squeeze, his gaze softening as he looked at his wife, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "I'm sorry I was late. No one will hurt you again." In that moment, Elwyn realized Cassian hadn't just arrived to defend her. He was there to deliver a powerful message. From this point forward, respect and dignity would be non-negotiable standards at Stellar Airways. A heavy silence enveloped the first-class cabin like a dense fog after Cassian Hartwell's arrival. No raised voice or dramatic gestures were needed. His razor-sharp gaze and steady, authoritative tone alone made the entire cabin hold its breath. Standing tall, one hand firmly on Elwyn Hartwell's waist, he spoke with a low, warm voice edged with warning. "She is my wife, and I want to know exactly what made anyone here think she doesn't belong in this cabin." Marigold Sinclair stammered, her words catching in her throat. The poised arrogance that usually defined her face had dissolved into pale, flustered panic. She forced a crooked smile, clutching her iPad as if it could shield her from the consequences bearing down. "We were merely following standard verification procedures, Mr. Hartwell," Thaddeus Hale interjected, attempting to salvage the situation. "Sometimes there are system errors. We didn't want to compromise the flight's safety." Cassian's gaze didn't waver from Marigold. "Is that so?" He tilted his head slightly, as if pondering. "Your standard verification procedure involves sizing up a passenger from head to toe and deciding they lack the qualities to sit here?" The question required no answer. Ophelia Fairchild fidgeted with her diamond ring, her eyes dodging contact. Alaric Pembroke, who had earlier shown impatience at Elwyn's scrutiny, now sat mute, his gaze fixed on an imaginary scuff on his shoe. Octavian and Lucian Kingsley straightened in their seats, their earlier smirks and shrugs gone. Even Zephyrine Bellamy, who typically nodded approvingly when someone was put in their place, pursed her lips, her manicured hand tightening on her handbag. Cassian turned to face the entire cabin. "Before she became my wife, Elwyn Hartwell was the youngest chief flight attendant in Stellar Airways history. She once saved a passenger's life mid-flight using nothing but instinct and expertise. Her name is still on the honor board at our headquarters." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Marigold and Thaddeus. "I wonder, have either of you ever set foot in the headquarters where you work?" No one responded. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin felt like a theater packed with spectators, its curtain yanked back to expose the backstage truth. Elwyn stood quietly, composed and resolute, She didn't need to speak, for today the unveiled prejudices spoke for her, and Cassian, with his authority and unwavering respect for her, had turned silence into the most compelling counterstrike. Cassian Hartwell's voice was no longer a question but a reaffirmation of value, not just for Elwyn Hartwell but for the entire first-class cabin. Now silent as if under a spell. Before she became my wife, Elwyn was the pride of Stellar Airways. She saved a passenger suffering a stroke mid-flight, acting before even the doctor seated nearby realized what was happening. Thanks to her calm and expertise, a life was preserved. He turned to face Marigold Sinclair, who stood with her head bowed so low her collar nearly touched her chin. And that's why her name remains on the honor board at our headquarters. Thaddeus Hale stood rigid, gripping the brim of his cap as if it were the only thing anchoring him. Marigold Sinclair, once the epitome of authority in her pristine uniform, was now just a woman confronting the direct consequences of the biases she had imposed on another. Cassian continued, his tone still calm but carrying an undeniable weight. I didn't fall in love with Elwyn because she's a beautiful woman, or because she carries the title of Cassian Hartwell's wife. I loved her because, as a flight attendant, she treated every passenger, from CEOs to unaccompanied children, with the same respect. Kindness isn't a skill, it's a quality. His final words rang out like a manifesto, prompting many in the cabin to lower their heads or look away. Ophelia Fairchild sat in silence, her mocking glint replaced by a heavy shame in her eyes. Alaric Pembroke pretended to focus on his phone, but his trembling fingers betrayed him as he scrolled. Octavia and Lucian Kingsley no longer giggled, their silence now tinged with caution. Zephyrine Bellamy, who had once smirked in disdain, clutched her jeweled handbag as if it could salvage the dignity she had just lost. Cassian pulled out his phone, typed a brief message, then looked up, his voice still measured but conclusive. I've just notified the board. Starting tomorrow, all Stellar Airways staff will undergo mandatory anti-discrimination training, and Marigold Sinclair, you will be the first. Marigold opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a choked breath escaped. The gold badge on her chest, once a symbol of pride, now seemed heavy enough to bring her to her knees. Cassian turned to Thaddeus Hale, his gaze icy. As for the Director of Customer Experience position we discussed, I believe the most qualified candidate is standing right here. He looked at Elwyn with profound respect. A lesson had been taught, not on a whiteboard, but through authority, kindness, and the unspoken shame of those who had judged wrongly. Cassian Hartwell's words rang through the first-class cabin like the final hammer strike closing a silent trial. The most qualified person is standing right here. No one doubted who he meant. Elwyn Hartwell, the woman who moments ago had been dismissed with judgmental glances and cutting remarks, now nominated for a position of power in an atmosphere that had been thick with disdain just minutes before. Stunned gazes slowly shifted to quiet respect, like notes changing key in a hushed symphony. Marigold Sinclair stood frozen, as if the weight of her mistakes pressed down on her shoulders. Her face, once perfectly made up for every flight, was now pale, like a canvas drained of color. The hands that once gestured with the authority of a queen commanding her court now fumbled nervously along the edge of a leather seat. From arrogance, she had plummeted into a pit of humiliation without anyone needing to push her. We will overhaul the entire process for welcoming and serving first-class passengers, Cassian continued, without glancing at any notes. And I believe that with her proven experience, intuition, and kindness, Elwyn Hartwell will lead that transformation. Thaddeus Hale nodded vigorously, his mouth struggling to form words of agreement as sweat beaded along his temple. He didn't dare question or plead to remain in the internal meeting after the flight. Every mental roster in his mind was being rewritten with a single name. Elwyn froze for a moment, unprepared for such a swift and public appointment. In her eyes flickered a mix of surprise and deep, quiet emotion. Not for the title, but because, for the first time in years, her dignity was acknowledged fairly in front of those who had once denied it. The passengers adjusted their demeanor one by one. Ophelia Fairchild buried her face in a magazine, her jewel-laden hands trembling slightly. Alaric Pembroke clasped his hands together, silent for longer than his usual loud demeanor allowed. Octavia and Lucian Kingsley leaned forward, their gazes now filled with admiration rather than skepticism. Even Zephyrine Bellamy, who scrutinized everything from speech to shoes, offered Elwyn a subtle nod when their eyes met. Cassian leaned in, speaking loudly enough for all to hear, his voice smooth as silk. "I apologize for the delay. To make up for it, champagne will be complimentary for the entire flight." Then, turning to Marigold, he lowered his voice just enough to carry. "Ensure my wife receives the care she deserves. Your career depends on it." Any lingering arrogance in Marigold's eyes was extinguished completely. She nodded, offering no argument or excuse, only bowing before the woman she had tried to diminish moments earlier. And so, the balance of power shifted. No fanfare, no alarms, just the right recognition delivered to the right person at the right time. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, a soft glow bathed the first-class cabin, as if trying to soothe the undercurrent of tension that had just swept through. But within Elwyn Hartwell, another storm was quietly brewing. She sat silently in the wide leather seat, her untouched glass of juice before her. Marigold Sinclair, having just poured it, stepped back with an almost unnatural deference, avoiding direct eye contact as if fearing Elwyn's gaze might peel back something raw within her. Elwyn nodded her thanks, a reflexive gesture from her years as a flight attendant, but instead of satisfaction, she felt only exhaustion. The sensation of winning a battle that should never have happened left her with a hollow void far greater than any pride. She couldn't stop wondering, if Cassian Hartwell hadn't stepped into the cabin at that precise moment, would she have been escorted away like a passenger out of place? Nothing more? Her gaze drifted to the window, where the endless blue sky remained eerily serene, in stark contrast to the layered clash that had just unfolded. Part of her knew Cassian had acted out of love, to shield her from the humiliation he couldn't bear to witness. But another part, the part that was once Elwyn Hartwell, the sharp, independent, and fiercely capable chief flight attendant, felt a pang of bitterness. She had once stood tall on her own merit, respected for who she was, not because she bore the Hartwell name. The faint sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Cassian sat beside her, his eyes softening as he noticed the pensive look on her face. He said nothing at first, only gently placing his hand over her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low enough to be private. Elwyn turned to him, managing a smile tinged with quiet resentment. "You know," she said slowly, "when I boarded this flight, I wanted to experience it as an ordinary passenger. No title, no one stepping aside for me." Cassian listened in silence, his eyes devoid of defensiveness. Just pure attention. Elwyn continued, her voice softer. "But in the end, I still needed your name to be respected. That makes me question myself." Cassian tightened his grip on her hand, not rushing to respond. He knew this wasn't the moment to dismiss her feelings, but to give her space to breathe, to rediscover herself. And Elwyn, in that silence, he began to realize that what hurt her wasn't the judgmental gazes of others. It was the moment she doubted her own worth. That was the true challenge she needed to face, before she could truly move forward. The sunset bathed the seaside resort's balcony in golden hues, where Elwyn Hartwell and Cassian Hartwell sat quietly together. The distant murmur of waves provided a gentle backdrop to a conversation they both knew could no longer be delayed. On the table, 2 glasses of wine shimmered with the day's fading orange-red light, while in Elwyn's eyes a tide of memories surged. Cassian leaned slightly forward, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass, but his gaze never left her face. Elwyn looked down at the watch on her wrist, a gift from the days when they were 2 different worlds, a proud flight attendant and an ambitious young entrepreneur. "Today," she began, her voice soft but each word deliberate, "reminded me of what I once had and what I've lost." Cassian didn't rush to respond, simply waiting. Elwyn turned to him, her eyes clear, not accusatory, not resentful, just seeking understanding. "You know," she continued, "when I was a flight attendant, I could stand before anyone and know I had my place. I didn't need anyone's backing. I did it myself. Today, I forgot what that felt like." A sea breeze stirred, gently lifting her hair like the wavering convictions in her heart. Cassian nodded faintly, as if he'd been listening from the very first moment. "I understand," he said, his voice low but sincere. "That's why I didn't tell you about the Director of Customer Experience role beforehand. I wanted you to know it's not a favor. It's an opportunity for the most deserving person." Elwyn looked at him, surprise mingling with emotion. "You planned to appoint me before today happened?" Cassian smiled, gentle but certain. "It was my anniversary gift to you, but ironically it came at the moment you were judged for the very things I love about you. Your simplicity, your sincerity, and a dignity no one's gaze can tarnish." Elwyn turned away, her eyes glistening but holding back tears. She was holding on not out of weakness, but because she needed time to process it all. The hurt, the pride, and a love that had never dimmed. "Cassian," she said, gently taking his hand, "I don't want to take that role because I'm your wife. I want to do it because I believe I can make a difference." He squeezed her hand, his gaze warm. "And that's why I chose you. Beneath the fiery sky of day's end, free of prejudice and titles, there were just two people facing each other with raw honesty." And in that moment, Elwyn began to believe that a new chapter was truly beginning on her own terms. The next morning, Elwyn Hartwell awoke in the sun-drenched room of the seaside resort, not with the usual rush, but with a rare stillness, as if her soul had been cleansed by a long rain. The sound of waves crashing against distant rocks and the chirping of birds filtering through the open window wove a gentle symphony she hadn't realized she'd been yearning for. On the table, a cup of tea waited, its warmth still lingering. Beside it was a small envelope, inscribed with familiar handwriting, "To Elwyn, from the one who believes in you, even when you doubt yourself." She smiled softly, opened it, and read Cassian's handwritten note. "When you're ready, let's start that new chapter together, one you write yourself." Gone were the mocking whispers of Ophelia Fairchild, the skeptical glances of Alaric Pembroke, and the scrutiny of Zephyrine Bellamy. Gone was the stratified cabin of the plane, the questioned tickets. There was only her Elwyn Hartwell, with a self forged anew from the ashes of prejudice. She stepped onto the balcony where Cassian stood waiting, holding 2 cups of coffee. He didn't need to say anything. That look, the one that had once singled her out in a crowd as if she were the only person in the world, was enough to tell her every choice was hers to make. "You know," Elwyn said, taking the cup from his hand, "I used to think strength came from standing alone, needing no one's support. But now I realize true strength is daring to accept help from someone I trust, without losing myself." Cassian nodded, his calm expression brimming with pride. "Your strength," he said, "never needed to be forced. It's there, even in your silence." And then, as if in an unspoken ritual, Elwyn set her coffee down and reached for the folder prepared the day before, the job description for the Director of Customer Experience at Stellar Airways. She no longer felt appointed because she was someone's wife. She was chosen because she, in Cassian's eyes, and now her own, was worthy. On the journey back, those who witnessed that moment on the flight would have stories to tell, but for Elwyn the only thing she needed to carry was her reborn confidence, not borrowed from another's power, but reclaimed from the trust she'd rediscovered in herself. And so a new page began, in quiet but with unwavering resolve. The story of Elwyn Hartwell and Cassian Hartwell reminds us that kindness and dignity don't need to be loud to be powerful. They have the strength to shatter any prejudice. Thank you for watching Millionaire and Heart Stories. See you on the next journey.